Welcome. We are now on Unit 2 of our course, Biblical Christianity. From Unit 1, you remember that we were looking at the difference between our own and cultural worldview and God's worldview. And we were making an argument for God's worldview and that we should approach life from His perspective. Well, we ended up by understanding that the way we come to know God's worldview is through the Bible. And so now, in this unit, we look at the Bible as the basis for God's worldview. For example, when you're old enough to vote, many kids, when they're old enough to vote and they have to choose a president or a mayor or anything like that, a lot of kids don't know what to do. They're not into politics. They don't read all the issues. And so for a lot of them to know what to do, often they'll ask their parents. And so their parents and their parents' position becomes the basis of who they decide to vote for. And then later on, as they become parents, they might even help their children understand what the issues are. So in other words, for young people, often their basis for who they vote for is their parents. Well, this is kind of what we're talking about. If you want a biblical worldview, you need a basis for that worldview. And we believe that basis is God's Word. In fact, there's a really great verse that speaks to it. It's found in 2 Timothy 3, verses 16 through 17. Let's read that verse together. That verse says, "All Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work." In other words, there's nothing you need to do that the Bible does not equip you for. If you want to do some bad things, then the Bible doesn't equip you for that. But if you want every good work, if you want to have a godly worldview, these verses tell us the Bible is the basis for every good work. So let's keep considering this answer. If you want to follow God's way, then look to the Bible. But if you want to follow your own way, then you can look everywhere else. And there are many places to look to follow your own way. You can go in so many different directions. But we're saying that we want to follow the Bible. Now, that leaves us with a question. Are we saying that the Bible has specific answers to all of the detailed questions in our lives? Well, we'd have to say no, because we don't read in the Bible about the internet. We don't read about human cloning. In fact, there are a number of issues people face in the world that we live in today that we don't read about in the Bible. So how then can the Bible equip us for every good work? Well, we're not saying the Bible speaks about every issue, but what we are saying is that the Bible provides the principles for how we should believe, how we should think, and how we should act in each situation. The principles to approach all of life are found in the Bibles, even if we don't find the actual specifics. That's what we believe when we talk about the Bible being the basis of our worldview. So don't worry to go and try and say, where am I going to find every little issue in the Bible? That's not what we're saying you should do, but we're saying become a student of the Bible, learn a biblical worldview, because from that you are going to learn some great principles for how to deal with all of life. And so in this course, we will examine some specific issues that are challenging for Christians today. We live in a world that challenges the Christian faith. And so what we need to do is say, what are these biblical principles that we learn from the Bible? And how do we apply these biblical principles to the challenges that we face today? So let's talk about a foundation for a biblical worldview. And what we have to say very clearly is that the biblical worldview must begin with God. We have to emphasize that point from the very beginning. We look to the Bible to learn about God. We learn about His nature, about His character, and about His activity. Now, let's make something clear. What we are saying is, we can know a lot about God, but we cannot know all there is about God. Nobody can know all there is about God. Such knowledge is not possible. We are not saying you are going to know every single thing about God. But what we are saying is that in a biblical worldview, God has revealed so much about Himself. He knows what we need. He knows the amount of information we need to know. And so He reveals much of Himself to us. If the worldview from God is in the Bible, then essentially what we're saying is all of the Bible is about God. It's about God primarily, not about me. It's about Him first. So, if we accept this, we then are left with the question, how do we see the world as God does? How do we learn from the Bible the way that God looks at the world? Well, the answer to that is just to begin reading from the very beginning in Genesis 1:1 all the way through the Old Testament, the New Testament, all the way to Revelation. If the Bible's all about God and He's chosen to give us the details in the Bible, then the answer is, well, read all of the Bible. Well, that's a great thing to do, and certainly all of us should be reading all of the Bible all the time. But in this course, we actually want to extract some specific passages and take specific teaching in the Bible that build these principles of a biblical worldview. We want to take specific passages and apply them to issues and circumstances that Christians face. So instead of starting at the beginning and trying to read the whole Bible, let's take some passages and look at those as we try to understand building a biblical worldview. Clearly, we can't look at everything, but we'll begin with some. And of course, the best place to begin is in the beginning. So let's begin with Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. We read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So very clearly from this very first verse in the Bible, we understand it starts with God. It's not you and me. We're not on the scene. God is here. A biblical worldview must start with God. It must be God-centered, not man-centered. That's very important to understand. And so we understand that God does not fit into the human way of seeing things, but rather we fit into the way God sees things. God doesn't fit my agenda fits His. It begins with Him, a God-centered approach. So a biblical worldview says that all things find their origin in God. That verse said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Anything that exists outside of God was created by Him. Well, right here, we have quite a significant clash with God's worldview and our worldview, a human worldview that is different to God. Right from the very first verse in Scripture, we find this challenge, because we have a clash between what we can call faith and reason. So let's talk about these two issues. First of all, the issue of faith. Faith is not saying, well, I'll just be ignorant and I'll just say, I don't need to find out anything. I'll just stay in the dark. That's not what we're saying by faith. What we say is we learn all we can about how creation happened, but we also accept that we are not God. And if that's the case, there'll be many things that we cannot know, but we believe because of what God has said. So if God said He created everything, we can explain some of it. There's a whole bunch we cannot, but we believe. Faith believes when we can't explain. Well, on the other side, you have reason. And so reason would say, with enough knowledge, we can explain the existence of everything. So therefore, faith is not needed. You don't need faith if reason and science and mathematics and all these things can explain. If a human worldview can explain the existence of everything, then you don't need a God worldview. You don't need a biblical worldview. So we understand that from a biblical worldview, we are coming at it from a point of view of a faith, not from a point of view of reason. Let's think of the illustration of where you may be taking a flight in an airplane for the first time. Well, if you're flying for the first time, you might think, well, I don't know about this. I don't know if I want to get in this round metal object and go so high in the sky. So you might do a bit of study first. You might say, well, let me study about airplanes. How do these things work? How does an airplane engine work, and the wings and the thrust and lift off and all these things, and how does it actually get into the air? And so there's a lot of things that you can learn about how an airplane works and how well trained a pilot is to take that airplane up in the sky. But then there's a point at which you're just going to have to accept and believe that this airplane will take you into the sky. Many people who fly for the first time are nervous because they get on this plane and they know, I think I know why this plane's going to fly, but there's a whole bunch I don't know. But I'm going to get on the plane anyway. And that's what we're talking about. You know, the biblical worldview, there's that faith side that we just believe God. He's told us many things, and we do learn many things. But there's some other things that we accept by faith, just because we trust Him for what He has said. So that's what we believe, starting right from Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. A biblical worldview must begin with that. But then what about, where do we go from there? Well, after that, we get to Genesis 1, verse 27. We have looked at this verse in the previous unit, but let's look at it again. In Genesis 1, verse 27, we read, God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him, male and female. He created them. Right here, we have some very important elements of a biblical worldview to do with man. Now remember, God is already on the scene. He comes before us. And so we already have God as a priority, but now we also have man. In Genesis 5, verse 1, we read again, this is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, He made him in the likeness of God. So a biblical worldview looks at this and says, first of all, humans are made in God's image and His likeness. That's something very special. A biblical worldview says that humans are not the same as animals. We're different to the animals. They don't have God's image within them. If that's true, if we have God's image and the rest of creation doesn't, especially animals don't, then we could not have come from animals. So a worldview that says that humans came and evolved from animals is not a biblical worldview. Because according to a biblical worldview in the verses we have just read, humans are made in God's likeness, and only humans. Therefore, we are unique from all of creation. Well, the other thing it said in that verse very clearly is that humans are made with a gender identity, male and female. This is also a biblical worldview. We believe that God makes people male and female intentionally. God makes them that way. He doesn't make a mistake. He knew we can't have everybody being a male and we can't have everybody being a female. He knew clearly what His plan was for us. And so a biblical worldview accepts that God has made us unique and in His image, and He has made us male and female. And we'll return to this particular issue in later lessons as we look at gender identity and things like that. But at this point, it's really important to understand this foundation. Okay, well, let's think about human currency as we try and understand this. If you look at all the different currencies in the world and they're laid out before you, you want to know, well, which one comes from where? Well, you look at one particular one and you see a man's image on it, and you look at that and say, that very clearly, I recognize that image. That is the king of Saudi Arabia. That must come from Saudi Arabia. And so as you look at various images on various world currencies, then you realize this tells me the image of this currency helps me understand where this currency comes from. Well, that's what we say about us as humans. That image of God that's on us helps us understand that we come from Him. We don't just come from nothing. We don't just come from evolving through animals. That's not our image. Our image is God's image, which tells us we belong to Him. And so that's an important basis for a biblical worldview. Well, we need to carry on, because in Genesis, it also in 1:28 is a very important scripture. God blessed them. God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth, subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So what are we saying from this particular verse? Well, a biblical worldview talks about man being put in charge of creation. Psalm 8 verse 6 puts it this way: "You make him to rule over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet." Now, a lot of people struggle with this because of the way that we have abused creation. And in many ways, because of man's sin, man has not looked after creation like he should. When God uses that word rule, it's meant in a very positive way. When it says put all things under his feet, it's meant to be a very positive thing, something that causes us to care for creation and to be responsible for creation. That's God's desire all along. And so biblical worldview understands that man has both a responsibility and an authority over creation. But also, in that Genesis passage says that men and women are to produce children. We are to multiply and fill the earth. And so we understand the need for there to be families all over the earth. And that's what we have. And so there's something unique about the family right there in the beginning. The importance of the family and the importance of the family filling the earth. We see that right in the beginning in Genesis as part of God's biblical worldview. So if we look at the family, we look at the man's role, and we say that men and women are to procreate and protect life. That's a very important part of a biblical worldview. We understand that there's a heavy responsibility that goes with this. We have both a responsibility and authority over creation, not to abuse, but to protect and to build up and to care for the creation that God has given us. And so we understand that in a biblical worldview, that's an important part of the way God has created us. Think about when you give a pet to a child, when you give a beautiful little puppy to your daughter or your son, do you just give it to them and say, well, all right, do whatever you want? Rather, you give them the little dog and you say, now, this is something very special. I want you to think about this little puppy I'm giving you. You need to look after it. If you look after this little puppy, it will bring you a lot of joy and you will have a lot of fun. But you not only have the joy of a puppy, you have a responsibility. And so you teach your child, how do you look after? When does the puppy need to be fed? Where would the puppy need to sleep? How do you care for this this precious little gift that you've been given. And so a child understands, as its parent teaches it, how to look after a pet. In fact, for many people, it's a wonderful way to teach your child how to be responsible for something else by giving your child a pet. That's what we understand, the same principle. God has given us authority over His creation. We have responsibility to look after the creation that God has given us. And so we want to be sure that we understand that from a biblical point of view. Well, there's another amazing chapter in the Psalms that really helps us understand in a biblical worldview, and it's Psalm 139. The important part about this psalm is to understand from a biblical worldview, God is very intimately involved with every one of us. He is not a God who just creates, puts us in responsibility and says, all right, I'm leaving, you guys take over. That's not the kind of God we serve. If you read this psalm, you read phrases like, you have searched me and known me. You are intimately acquainted with all my ways. And elsewhere the psalmist says, where can I flee from your presence? In fact, he says, if I go to the heavens, you're there. If I go down to the bottom of the earth, you're there. If I go anywhere I try and flee, I can't. You're always with me. In fact, he makes it so intimate. He says, you wove me in my mother's womb. Even before I was born, from my moment of conception, you were there. You were very personal in my life. So this is an amazing psalm that shows a very personal worldview. God is very, very personal with us as His children. He's intimately involved with every one of us from the moment of conception. You know what that means? There is never a time where you will find yourself in any place or any situation where God is not already there. You are never alone. You're never by your side. God is very, very intimately involved from conception for the rest of your life. That's an amazing part of a biblical worldview, because there's so many other religions and worldviews that make God far away. They acknowledge a creator God and a God that will judge one day and a God that looks down from afar. That's not the biblical worldview. We have a very personal God, and we learn that from passages like Psalm 139. Well, some people say, well, if God's so intimately involved in my life right now, where is He? I've got some bad things happening in my life. I've got some real needs. And if God was only here, He could bless me and just sort out all my problems. So if He's so personal, where is He? In fact, the really difficult question we all try and answer is, where is God when there is evil and suffering? Well, part of the answer is to understand God is not left. He is there, but not as a dictator. He's not a God who so dominates your person that you have no free will. That's not the God of the Bible, that just dominates and says, right, if ever there's a problem, I'm just going to take care of everything. You have no choice. That's not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible allows free will, and that means there are consequences of having free will. He is always there, but He's not a dictator. And so we need to understand this concept of free will, that we have this God who's in control of everything and rules the world, but yet allows humans to make choices and experience the consequences of those choices. That's part of how God has made us. A biblical worldview understands that we as humans have free will, and as a result have to face the consequences of our free will. When those choices are not according to God's ways, things go from bad to worse. Life is not good. Well, Why is it like this? Part of the answer that God allows this is because He's not looking at the short-term situation that we are. His focus is not just on my situation here and now. God is looking at it from an eternal perspective. He knows that a bad situation in this life may very well cause me to cry out in desperation to Him and say, God, I can't fix this anymore. I'm desperate. And when I call out to Him, then I find hope for eternity. Often when people are very comfortable and life is going just good, they don't need God. Life is good. I don't need God. I can look after myself. If I ever need God, I'll just take Him off the shelf and I'll use Him when I need Him. That's not a biblical worldview. And so often God allows us the consequences of our sin because He knows that people tend to need Him more when life is tough. When things are difficult and you come to the end of yourself and you don't know what to do, you cry out to God and say, God, I need your help. A great example of this we find in the New Testament in the prodigal son. In Luke chapter 15, verse 11 through 32, we read this great story about the lost son. And really, it's a story about God the Father. It's one of three parables to do with something that's lost. And this particular verse shows how the Father understands His Son completely. He knows the problems His Son will face, but He allows this younger son to make his own choices in life. And these choices end up in a very bad place. He ends up working amongst the pigs on a farm, having wasted everything that his father had given him. The Father knows that. The Father doesn't condemn him every step that he takes. He allows him to experience the consequences of his sin and his bad choice. And He waits for him with open arms, so that when the son in his desperation finally realizes, I will go back to my father. My father will treat me maybe not like a son, maybe like his servants, but that's better than what I have now. So the son calls out in desperation to the Father, and we see the wonderful conclusion of the Father welcoming him not like a servant, but welcoming him with open arms as the son that belongs to the Father. So we understand this is how God is with us. He gives us free will. He lets us experience the consequences of our free will. But He is always there as the God who is intimately involved in our lives, loving us, waiting with open arms to receive us back again. That is part of the biblical worldview. Another great book in the Bible to understand God's worldview, the biblical worldview, is the book of Proverbs. You can read through the book of Proverbs from the beginning to the end and just gain so much wisdom. In fact, that is probably a key word to understand the book of Proverbs. So do you want wisdom to live out your life? You'll find many things in the book of Proverbs. Let's just read a few of these. So we see in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Oh boy, we have so many people pursuing so much knowledge. In fact, we're told that knowledge, every day our knowledge doubles because of the internet and because of all the things we're discovering. And so people, you can go and study so many different subjects at a school or university or college that'll give you lots and lots of knowledge. But this verse says, if you really want to be wise, understand that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Well, here's another well-known verse in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 5 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. That's a warning. It's saying, listen, if you think you can figure things out, if you think you know what's best for your life, be careful. Trust God. You will get in trouble if you lean on your own understanding. And many of us can share examples of how when we try to lead on our understanding, we got into trouble. So there's a great piece of wisdom for us. Another one in chapter 11, verse 4 says, riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. People think, well, if I could just have more money or more things, I would be good. I just need more stuff. This proverb warns against that. Be careful. When it comes to eternity, your riches do not help you at all. But righteousness will deliver you from death. That's a very important verse, and it means you need to think about what is righteousness and where does it come from. Well, let's look at one more in the Proverbs. Chapter 13 and verse 1 says, a wise son accepts his father's discipline, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. Oh man, if people would listen to this verse. So many people think, man, what do my parents know? They're old-fashioned. They don't live in my world. They don't understand what I face. And so many people just turn to their friends or to social media or to other things to figure out how to live life. This verse says, your father and your mother, they've been through life. They've made mistakes and they've learned many things. You need to listen to them. You need to accept your father's discipline on your life. Don't turn away when your father seeks to help you. Be wise and listen and accept your father's discipline. This is a biblical worldview. So to develop a biblical worldview, we now also look at the New Testament. And we can't look at everything, but we'll look beginning with Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 40. And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. Well, let's break down and look at what he's meaning here. He's saying everything. If you want to know, there's so many details, but if you want to know how they fit together, you get down to these two essential ideas. To love the Lord your God with all that you are, and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So let's have a look. First of all, love for God is first. Love for God is above everything else. It starts the first commandment, love God with everything. So we must begin there. If you have a choice to love God or love somebody else, you choose to love God. God is always before everything. That's number one. Then secondly, love for humans is second. So you love God first, you love humans next. Then look at the words that's used about the love for God. You love God with your heart, with your soul, and with your mind. It's all encompassing. It's a way of saying love Him with all that you are. Everything that's part of your life is part of loving God. So this passage is interesting. If Jesus is summarizing all the commands of the Bible in these two, we understand that this idea of love then is foundational. It's a way of interpreting the other commands. If you take another part of what God tells you to do and you go against loving God and loving others, then you have to question whether you're obeying that properly. A worldview that is biblical must be based on these two commands. And it must be a way in which you understand other things that are written in the Bible. Well, it's also significant to understand the word for God that is used here. And in the original Greek language, the word that is used here is based on the word agape, that Greek word agape. It's a special kind of love that we understand is both unconditional, sacrificial, and focused on others. Unconditional, sacrificial, and focused on others. That is a very deep kind of love. That is a love that is unusual. That's a love that's not normally found in a worldview from a specific personal culture. That is found in a worldview that comes from God. That special kind of love. Well, let's look at the example of this in the image of God. Because of the image of God in all humans, there are times when any human can show this kind of love. But for it to characterize a person's life, for it to be part of all that you do, that requires a biblical worldview. Not that you just do it every now and then, but that it's part of your life. It seeps through you into what you do. It requires a biblical worldview. It doesn't just happen with a cultural or personal worldview. And so, as we think about this, we need to continually understand how the New Testament builds on this kind of love, this kind of worldview. God is love, and He calls us to love Him and to be characterized by love, but we have a problem. That's the other part. We saw it in Genesis 3 in the Old Testament. Now we see it again in Romans chapter 3. And in Romans chapter 3, verse 10 through 12, we read, "There is none righteous, not even one." The best person you know, the best person you've ever heard of, is not good enough, is not righteous, does not satisfy God's standard of righteousness. There's no one righteous, not even one. Verse 11 says, "There are none who understand, there are none who seek for God." In other words, our natural tendency is to go our own way and not God's way. We don't seek God's way by ourselves. We seek our own way. It says in verse 12, "All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good, not even one." So again, it's not that sometimes you can do good. It's talking about the pattern of your life. What characterizes you is that you are a good person and most of your life you just do good. It says no. That kind of person, by themselves, in their natural state, we don't find a person like that. If we carry on in verse 13, it gets real specific and actually describes a rather bleak situation. Verse 13 says, "Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep the poison of asps is under their lips deceiving." Even our voices, even the words we use, the things that we say, even those things are not righteous and don't follow naturally after God. Verse 14 says, "Whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness, their feet are swift to shed blood." This paints a very difficult picture of a worldview that is not according to God, of a worldview that's based on man instead of God's righteousness. And so this is a very difficult thing, but it's part of what we understand in a biblical worldview. Well, let's conclude this bad news as we read 16, 17, and 18. Verse 16 says, "Destruction and misery are in their paths. The path of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes." There we have it. A very difficult situation. So we have to understand, just as we learnt in Genesis chapter 3, and we now learn again in Romans chapter 3, man has fallen. A biblical worldview understands that man by himself is without God, and man by himself does not choose the way of righteousness. Even though at times he might be able to do some good things, the general pattern of his life is not good. That's what a biblical worldview teaches. And so, if we look in these chapters, we understand that man is fallen. Humanity is fallen. That is the biblical worldview. It's not a popular worldview, because today people think that how can you judge? How can you say people are fallen? How can you be so negative and so critical? Well, there's a lot of good news, but we also need to understand the bad news. The bad news says there are no naturally good people who are characterized by loving God and loving others. It is not natural. In fact, Romans 3 verse 23 says, all have sinned, and so as a result, all need salvation. There is no one that is beyond the need of salvation. This is a biblical worldview. If all have sinned and all follow their own ways, then all need salvation. This is very fundamental to a biblical worldview. So people say, well, there are people around the world who are just naturally nice people, and if they've never heard about God, they're noble, and they just are inclined to good. Well, that may be what the world says, or anthropology, or other science tells you, but it is not a biblical worldview. The reality of a biblical worldview is that all of man is fallen. Well, if that's the case, then how do we understand it? How do we understand what's supposed to happen? If your natural state of life is to walk away from God and not to walk towards God, then there's a problem. What can man do? Well, another interesting part of this worldview, just a little bit later in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, is a very interesting verse when it comes to a biblical worldview. And it says, we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. God causes all things to work together for good. This is often a misunderstood verse, but it's a very important verse to develop a biblical worldview. So let's break it down and look at it. A biblical worldview accepts not all things are good. That's not what this verse says. Oh, everything is good. There's evil in the world. There are bad things in the world. Not all things are good. But what this verse does say is that God uses all things in a way that results in good for a Christian from his perspective. God knows that he can take a situation that is evil and bad, and he can use it to bring good in your life and to draw you closer to him. So this helps us understand something. If I'm a Christian, then I understand I am already living eternal life, and that God is working for my good for eternity, not just for this little situation that I see right now that's getting me down, but God's actually working in my life for my good for all eternity. So, even if something is really difficult right now, and I actually can't see the solution in this life, I understand that God working my life for good in my future is bringing a time when he will bring good. Whether it's in this life or the life to come, God is working for my good. So I don't just have to see the good in this life, I can see it with eternity in view, the way God does. So I may struggle with a really difficult illness. I may struggle with a very difficult situation and wonder, in this life, how am I ever going to get out of it? Well, I've got to remember that the perspective of this verse is God sees all of my life, all of eternity. And he may work it out in this life, but he may also work it out in eternity. That is the God that I serve. That is part of understanding a biblical worldview. Well, we come to a very challenging verse as well in Scripture to understand a biblical worldview that rarely clashes with a cultural worldview and a worldview that's all about ourselves. And this is found in the book of Philippians, chapter 1, verse 21. Paul makes a very difficult statement here about his worldview. He says, "For me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." He has a very specific worldview. Our culture would say, if he was a cultural Christian, he might say, "For me, to gain everything I can in this life, that's what I want. And if I die, I get Jesus." That's not what Paul says. He says, my worldview says, if whatever I do to live in this life, my absolute priority is Christ. I point to Him, I live for Him, it's all for Him. And if I die, I know where I'm going. For me, that's gain. Well, sometimes when we live in our comfortable existence, where many of us don't face this kind of challenge that we know Paul faced, this verse can be academic, but there are many people in this world who actually have to live this verse out literally. There are Christians right now in Syria who are facing this personally in their lives. There's a story of a father, a Christian pastor, and his son who were crucified by ISIS because they said, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain." They had been Muslims who had converted to Christianity, and ISIS said to them, "Convert back or you're in trouble." And they said, "We cannot. We now follow Jesus." So they tortured the son by cutting off his fingers. And when that didn't cause them to give up Jesus, they crucified them both. They understood in a very real way what Paul meant. That's a biblical worldview says, I follow Christ no matter what. I count the cost no matter what. It's a difficult teaching. We like a biblical worldview that says, oh, everything's good. Lord, bless me and cause your face to shine upon me. We like those verses. But what about this one in Philippians? For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. That's a very significant part of a biblical worldview. Well, there are some serious challenges to a biblical worldview. There are many we can talk about, but we can think of them classified in three important categories. First of all, one of the challenges to a biblical worldview is this whole idea of tolerance. Tolerance says, just love and accept those who don't see things the way that you are. Tolerate each other. You don't have to take a stand on something against somebody else. Just tolerate. So, for example, with the issue of abortion, people would say, well, look, if you don't like abortion, that's fine for you, but just accept somebody who does. Just live together at peace and just all work together. Don't be opposing each other when it comes to these issues. That's this idea of tolerance. In other words, there aren't really hard and fast standards. We just tolerate each other according to our personal worldview. Well, that's a real challenge to a biblical worldview that we've already seen says that God is intimately involved in your life from the moment of conception. We've already seen that. So what do we do with tolerance? Well, a second big challenge to a Christian worldview is relativism. Relativism says there are no universal standards other than just be nice. If you're just nice to everybody, it'll all work out. Don't set standards that will clash with people, because if someone doesn't like your standard, that's not nice. So be nice. You decide what's right for you, they decide what's right for them. So if you want to decide what your gender is, it doesn't matter what God says He created you, male or female, you decide. And there's no standard as to what a male or a female is. It's whatever you think and whatever you decide. That's your choice. When it comes to human sexuality, you make the choice. Whatever's nice, whatever pleases you, I should just accept. I mustn't create universal standards that judge you. This is relativism, and it's a challenge to a biblical worldview where God has clear standards. And those standards are not relative. They're absolute. Well, the third challenge to a biblical worldview is this idea of hedonism. In other words, whatever makes me feel good is right. My kids tell me it's YOLO. You only live once. So do whatever you want. Enjoy the moment right now. Whatever makes you feel good now, live for today. Make yourself happy today with whatever you want to do. Well, the big example of this that we see that's a big challenge to Christianity in the world today is materialism. And we're going to look at some lessons that are going to speak to this and the whole idea of wealth and riches and the pursuit of the world and worldly gain. This is hedonism. Enjoy it now. Have as much as you want now. Have a party with your life today. These are big challenges to a biblical worldview. So we need to recognize them. We need to understand how they are challenging our life today. And we need to understand they're not compatible with a biblical worldview. So, let's look at life God's way. We've looked at a few passages that help us to see how the Bible helps us to build a worldview that looks at life God's way. These are not all the passages. We could study throughout every verse of the Bible. There's so many things. Jesus taught the Sermon on the Mount, and he said, blessed are those, and he gave so many results of what it is. In John 15, Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches, and he tells us about a biblical worldview. We find this biblical worldview all through the Bible. We've just been able to look at some of them. Perhaps the way to go forward is to rather look at some specific issues and then say, based these issues, let us now apply the Bible, and so discover a biblical worldview as we deal with these issues. And so in the next class, that's what we're going to do. In the next unit, we will focus on some specific issues that we face in our lives and decide how do we apply Scripture and therefore a biblical worldview to those issues.